The evening was supposed to be simple. A formal business dinner, a chance for my husband to impress his boss and colleagues, nothing more. I had attended these kinds of events before: stiff conversations, polite smiles, and the occasional forced laughter. I knew the drill. But tonight felt different. As I stood in front of the mirror, slipping into my sleek black dress, I hesitated for a moment before making a decision that sent a thrill through me. No bra. The fabric clung to my curves in just the right way, the silky material molding to my body like a second skin. It wasn't scandalous, but it was noticeable. A choice that walked the fine line between elegant and daring. A small smirk tugged at my lips as I smoothed my hands down my sides. Would my husband notice? Would anyone notice? By the time we arrived at the upscale restaurant, the dining area was already bustling with low murmurs of conversation, clinking glasses, and the soft hum of background music. Dim lighting cast a warm, intimate glow over the room. My husband led me toward a private section where his boss and a small group of executives were seated. "Darling, you look stunning," he whispered against my ear as he pulled out my chair. His hand briefly grazed my lower back, lingering just a little longer than necessary. I smiled, feeling the heat of his touch. I know. As we settled in, introductions were made, wine was poured, and conversation flowed effortlessly. I kept my posture poised, my shoulders relaxed, my expressions carefully measured. But I could feel it, the weight of someone's gaze lingering a little too long. At first, I assumed it was just my imagination, a side effect of my own boldness. But then, as I reached for my glass, I saw him. My husband's boss. His eyes flickered to my chest, just a second too long before he lifted his gaze to meet mine. The corner of his mouth twitched, his expression unreadable. A rush of heat flooded my skin. I quickly looked away, pretending not to notice, but my pulse quickened. I could still feel him watching me. Every subtle movement I made, every shift in my posture, it was as if I had his undivided attention. I pressed my thighs together under the table, suddenly hyper-aware of my own body. The conversation carried on, but the air between us had changed. It was unspoken, lingering, charged with something that wasn't supposed to be there. As the evening went on, the wine flowed freely, loosening inhibitions. Laughter erupted at the table at intervals, but I barely registered the conversations. Instead, I was acutely aware of him. The way his gaze would land on me every time I so much as reached for my glass, the way his fingers traced the rim of his own wine glass absent-mindedly while his eyes traced me. At one point, I excused myself to the restroom, needing a moment to breathe, to collect myself. As I walked through the dimly lit corridor leading to the restrooms, I could still feel the heat of his eyes lingering on my skin. It was exhilarating. It was dangerous. It was reckless. I took a deep breath and checked my reflection in the mirror. My cheeks were slightly flushed, and my lips were parted as if I had just run a marathon. I leaned against the counter for a moment, trying to ground myself. Then, I heard the door open behind me. I straightened immediately, my pulse spiking. For a split second, I thought it might be my husband, but I knew better before I even turned around. It was him. My breath caught as I met his gaze in the mirror. He had followed me. "Everything all right?" he asked, his voice low, smooth, unreadable. I swallowed hard, my throat suddenly dry. Yes, just needed a moment. He stepped closer, just enough that I could feel the warmth of his body. Not close enough to be inappropriate, but close enough that I knew this wasn't a coincidence. "You've been distracted tonight," he murmured. I turned slightly, meeting his eyes directly. "Have I?" A small smirk tugged at his lips. I noticed things. My heart pounded. The weight of the moment pressed down on me, thick and charged with an energy I wasn't sure I wanted to acknowledge. A long silence stretched between us, and then, finally, he stepped back, exhaling softly. "You should head back before they wonder where you've gone." I nodded quickly, brushing past him and exiting the restroom, but even as I returned to the table, I could still feel the ghost of his presence behind me. I sat down, forcing a polite smile as my husband leaned over. "Everything okay?" he asked. I nodded again. "Fine. Just freshening up." But as I reached for my wine glass, my hands were still trembling. And I knew that whatever had just happened wasn't over. The rest of the evening passed in a blur. I tried to focus on the conversations at the table, on my husband's words, on the clinking of silverware against plates. But my mind was elsewhere. I could still feel the weight of his gaze, the way his presence seemed to linger, even after he had stepped away. My body was betraying me, reacting to something I knew I shouldn't even entertain. But the tension had settled deep in my bones, and no amount of polite small talk was enough to shake it. I stole a glance across the table. His eyes met mine instantly. Unapologetic. Bold. He didn't look away, and neither did I. The silent exchange sent a shiver down my spine. My husband, blissfully unaware, reached for my hand under the table, giving it a gentle squeeze. I turned to him with a smile, forcing myself to focus. But even as I did, I felt another touch, this one unseen but just as powerful. Dinner finally came to an end, and as we all stood to leave, I felt an odd mix of relief and disappointment. Relief that the night was over. Disappointment that the unspoken game between us had no conclusion. Or so I thought. As I excused myself to retrieve my coat from the back of the restaurant, I felt a presence behind me. Before I even turned, I knew. Leaving so soon? His voice was low, smooth, carrying the same confident ease he had exuded all night. I inhaled sharply, willing my pulse to settle. It's late. It is. There was a pause. Then, you enjoyed yourself tonight? I turned slowly, meeting his gaze in the dimly lit corridor. It was a nice dinner. His lips curved slightly. You know that's not what I meant. My breath hitched, but I didn't look away. I should have walked past him. Should have ended this before it became something I wouldn't be able to take back. But I didn't move. The space between us felt charged, the air crackling with something dangerous. His gaze flickered lower for a split second, barely noticeable, but enough. Enough to send a fresh wave of heat coursing through me. Your husband is waiting, he murmured, his voice barely above a whisper. I swallowed. I know. He leaned in ever so slightly, close enough that I could feel the warmth of his breath against my skin. Then why are you still standing here? The question hung between us, heavy and unanswered. My fingers clenched against the soft fabric of my coat, my body tense with something I couldn't name. A moment stretched too long, too filled with possibility. And then, finally, I took a step back. Good night, I whispered, my voice barely steady. He exhaled, watching me for another lingering moment before nodding once. Good night. I turned and walked away, each step feeling heavier than the last. When I reached my husband, he wrapped an arm around my waist, pressing a kiss to my temple. Ready to go? I nodded, leaning into his touch, grounding myself in the familiarity of him. But even as we walked out into the cool night air, even as I held his hand, I could still feel him. His presence. His eyes. The undeniable shift between us that I knew wouldn't simply disappear. The drive home was quiet. My husband hummed along to the soft music playing on the radio, completely at ease, while I sat stiffly in the passenger seat, replaying the events of the evening over and over again. My fingers traced the hem of my dress absent-mindedly, my skin still tingling in places I knew he had looked. When we pulled into our driveway, I exhaled slowly, as if I had been holding my breath the entire ride. My husband glanced at me. You okay? You've been quiet. I forced a smile. Just tired. He nodded, stretching as he got out of the car. That was a nice dinner, though. I think things went well. I hesitated before responding. Yeah, it was a good night. The words felt heavy in my mouth, laced with something unspoken. My husband didn't seem to notice, already moving toward the front door. I followed him inside, my heels clicking softly against the floor, but even as I moved through the familiar space of our home, I couldn't shake the sensation lingering in my chest. I headed to the bedroom, pulling off my earrings, letting my hair down, trying to shake off the evening. My reflection in the mirror showed flushed cheeks, slightly parted lips, and eyes that held something I didn't want to name. Then, my phone buzzed. I froze, my heart skipping a beat. Reaching for it slowly, I glanced at the screen. A message. From him. My breath caught in my throat as I hesitated before opening it. I still notice. A shiver ran down my spine. My fingers hovered over the screen, debating. Respond? Ignore it? Pretend none of this had ever happened? I exhaled shakily, locking my phone and setting it down on the dresser. But even as I climbed into bed beside my husband, even as I closed my eyes and willed myself to sleep, I knew one thing for certain. This wasn't over. Not even close.